the secret, the super secret part about being a catalyst is you have to be comfortable with risk and uncertainty and doubt. And if you're not, then it makes it a much more stressful role than it probably is to begin with.
Hi, I'm Tracy Lovejoy.
And I'm Shannon Lucas. We are the co-CEOs of Catalyst Constellations, which is dedicated to empowering catalysts to create bold, powerful change in the world.
This is our podcast, Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, where we speak with Catalyst executives about ways to successfully lead transformation in large organizations.
And today, I'm thrilled to have time with my good friend, Abby Kearns. Welcome, Abby.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm excited to hear what you're going to share with us. As a bit of background for our listeners, Abby is the Chief Technology Officer at Alembic Technologies. She's a veteran tech executive, as well as a board director and angel investor. Her career has spanned executive leadership, product marketing, product management, and consulting across Fortune 500 companies and startups alike, including Puppet, Cloud Foundry Foundation, Pivotal Software, Verizon, and Totality. Abby currently serves as a board director for Lightbend, StackPath, and Invoke. All right, so that's the part that they can read online about you, but we would love to hear about your catalytic journey, maybe with a few career highlights that you're proud of that help us see your catalytic nature.
Well, I think first and foremost, we should start with, I didn't realize I had a catalytic nature until I read this amazing book that you and Tracy wrote, because up until that point, I just thought I was a pain in the ass. So, it's understanding that there's a name for it is super helpful. And I give full credit to our shared dear friend, Chris Cravens, who introduced us and who started off with, you should definitely read this book.
Thanks, Chris.
So big shout out to Chris. But yeah, but when you read the book, which by the way, if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't read the book, highly recommend. I give it out to people all the time. I've never told you this, Shannon, but I do refer it to people quite a bit. And everyone I know that reads it, they're like, oh my God, there's a name for this. Everyone has just gone through their career without without the ability to clearly identify and articulate what exactly is the problem. But we all, everyone collectively that is similar in nature as the catalysts that are described in your book do feel that they're different, but they don't know why. And so it's like growing up feeling like you're the difficult one, right? And you're like, and you're like, well, am I difficult, or do I just have very strong opinions about what should be done and am comfortable voicing those opinions? Which for those of us that grew up as women and young women, we're told we're bossy.
Yep.
Bossy, opinionated, type A, all of those monikers that were just clever ways of saying, actually, maybe you've got a clear vision of the work we need to do and are really comfortable taking charge in the situation and bringing people along with you or dragging them along behind you, whichever, however it works at the moment. Yeah. But I'd say my journey I feel like in retrospect, having read that book and that moment in time and looking back over my career and actually speaking to you on a number of occasions, I recognized the catalyst along the entirety of my career, going back to even when my first job out of college, I got the only job I could get was a project manager at Sabre, which does the res system for American Airlines. And I landed my first job as a project manager there in the global infrastructure division, which I didn't know what global infrastructure was or what that meant. And I learned a lot around infrastructure, data centers, middleware, all of those things. And I loved it. And I loved leading the team, and I loved doing really hard, complex problems. And frankly, that's where I really caught the bug of being on the enterprise side, doing very large distributed systems at scale, the complex, the hard. I just fell in love with that and have stayed with it for the last 25 years. But if I look back with the lens of what is a catalyst, I see it, oh, okay, it showed up in my first job. Oh, and that showed up in my second job as well. It's like, okay, well, we're going to drive this project forward. We're going to do this, and I'm going to make sure it happens, whether you want to or not. This is what we're doing. We're going to make it happen. And it continued to show up. And I really found myself not being the kind of person that fit well into the stasis mold, but more the one that pokes their head up and says, what can we do better? What can we do different? How do we push the envelope just a little bit further? How do we achieve a little bit more? And how do we reach for the stars in the process? And I think that that's something that has been throughout my career. And I had to learn the hard way what that means, because that means that there's some organizations and some teams that I'm not a good fit for. And had you written your book, I don't know, 15 years earlier, that'd have been super helpful, but better late than never.
I feel the same way. I wrote it for my 20-something-year-old self for sure. Just on a personal note, like how did you navigate? Because like if you don't know that you're a catalyst and you don't have the distance or perspective, or the naming of it can feel really personal when you don't fit onto the team. Like what would you say to yourself 15 years ago about that?
Well, I think I was always ambitious and always wanted to do good work. And so I think where I ended up was, working twice as hard. I was also, more often than not, particularly the first 10 years of my career, I was the only woman in the room. And so I felt like I had to work twice as hard. So I would just continue to work really, really hard, trying to fit in, trying to do all the work, but also how do I like fit into the mold that on the team I'm on? And I think the answer, right or wrong, was just work twice as hard and try to conform. And I think it's hard to apply today's knowledge though with that, because this was also 25 years ago. And tech as a job was still early. And we didn't have a lot of the framing we have today with the way we work, and what we didn't talk about things like collaboration. Like things we take for granted today. We didn't have design thinking. All the things that we take for granted in terms of the way high functioning teams work, we didn't have the language around that. We knew what worked and what didn't. You kind of feel your way through it. But there wasn't something you could just say, oh, how do we make a high functioning team more productive? Like it's just things we didn't talk about. And I think that we have a different language and a different expectation around that work today. But back then, I would say that I worked twice as hard, but everyone was working twice as hard. We were all trying to figure out the early days of a lot of the technology that I was in, particularly on the infrastructure side, which was sort of bleeding edge. I did a lot in early days of e-commerce. We were all just figuring it out. So I guess the upshot was nobody really knew what was going on.
Yes, and like I was convinced everybody else knew. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, there was part of that, the imposter syndrome, I guess, for myself early as a woman.
Hey, I mean, I had that as well. I definitely assumed other people did. I'm just saying in retrospective, like nobody really knew. We were all sort of winging it, and we were just flinging stuff around as quickly as possible.
Which I think may still be true for more context than not. Like the more senior, older I've gotten, where I'm like, yeah, we're all just showing up and taking our best stab at it, I'm curious how you relate to the concept of catalyst in your executive role.
That is more interesting, and I've definitely put another lens on it the older I get and the further I get in my career, which is one of the things that, and I know you talk about this quite a bit in your book too, but one of the things that I don't know that enough executives internalize is, in order to be a catalyst and be truly a catalyst where you're truly trying to change the way things work, in order to do that, you have to be comfortable with a couple of things that most of us are not by our nature comfortable with. One is being wrong a lot. Two is the high degree of risk you have to take on a regular basis. When you're having to chart the path forward, there is no path. And so as a leader, particularly those of us that have grown up and watched other people, you feel like one, you always have to be right. And two, you have to know where you're going and you have to be clear about it. And sometimes, particularly when you're paving the way, you don't know, but you have to pretend you know. But you don't really know. And you're sort of taking a risk with the bets you're making that you're going to get there because it's unknown where you're going to end up. And I think that all of that, particularly for those of us that have been in this field a long time, are not always comfortable with that. And the secret, the super secret part about being a catalyst is you have to be comfortable with risk and uncertainty and doubt. And if you're not, then it makes it a much more stressful role than it probably is to begin with. And that's something I think that we don't talk enough about as leaders.
Yeah. How did you get comfortable with those two things?
I think I think I've always had that level of comfort. I look back to the early part of my career. After Sabre, I did a short stint at EDS, but then I ended up leaving and joining an early stage startup that was doing managed services. And I think that when you're a young early stage startup and you have to be you're the people that know what we're doing in these situations for these large companies. Like
Uh-huh.
you're the consultant that's like telling people what to do in the early days of e-commerce when literally no one was doing e-commerce. It's like you kind of learn how to like take risk and be uncertain, but also be confident in your uncertainty.
Yes.
And so I think I learned that trick early on and it just kind of stuck with me. But I've seen a lot of other executives really struggle with, well, how's this going to work out? I don't know. Maybe it'll work. We'll see. But my ability to say with certainty that this is how it's going to play out if we choose to do this, and this, particularly if you're transforming a team or organization or moving to a large technology or pivoting something, the level you can collectively understand the steps you need to take, but how those steps along the way will work out, most time you don't know. And expect, kind of appreciating that should be part of the journey, but it's also something I think we need to get more comfortable as a collective talking about. Like, who knows? Maybe that'll still work. Maybe it won't. I don't know.
It's so true because it's like, okay, so as a catalyst, what the research says is people will describe us as being comfortable with risk and ambiguity. But often the truth is for us, right or wrong. So I like your first point, like we might be wrong. But once we have that vision, we're like, it's risky not to do this thing. So it's a little bit of a reframe on like our relationship with risk, because sometimes to us it doesn't seem risky, though to everyone else it might totally seem risky. But I think there's the other layer here, which is, we get to talk with so many organizations, and embracing ambiguity is like if you actually have a strategy that you think is going to stay the same for 5 years, you're already wrong, right? So it's like, as catalyst executives, do we help our organizations like navigate that risk? And like, we're going to have to try something, right? And might as well be this thing. So super interesting.
Well, it's a hard thing, and I feel like I'm saying a very watered down version of it, but it is actually a bigger challenge, particularly the bigger the organization gets. I cite Clayton Christensen's work from the 90s a lot, Innovator's Dilemma. And if you haven't read the book and you're in any technology job, I highly recommend that be required reading, because every company you work at hits Innovator's Dilemma at some point in the journey. And the short version of that is that the thing that drives the bulk of the revenue for your company, your team, your product will one day hit a wall, and you have to come up with what you're going to do next. And it doesn't matter what you've invented, you will eventually hit that wall. And switching gears into a different product line or different feature set or different capability is incredibly difficult because you're having to say no to the thing that works. Because oftentimes you're saying no to the thing that works when it's actually still working. And you're going to have to say yes to something that you're not sure is actually going to work. There's a leap of faith you have to take to manage that transition. And not everyone is comfortable making that transition. And that's where I think catalysts honestly shine, is because there is a level of uncertainty, and catalysts will often leap into that uncertainty and say, we will figure it out. We'll probably be wrong, because you probably will be, but we're going to learn, quickly iterate, and try something else. And I think really leaning into that, and organizations leaning into supporting those individuals is key for that journey. But I think it's also the hardest thing to do, because you're not only gambling on an uncertain future, but you're gambling on an individual or a handful of individuals that can shepherd you through that uncertainty. And in a time where every bone in your body says that's probably wrong. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do for anyone in large companies. I mean, it's hard. I feel like it's easier in smaller companies, particularly startups, because there's an expectation things will fail fast and we'll try something else. But the bigger that revenue number is every year, the harder it gets.
100%. And the more monolithic the product set is in a large enterprise, the harder that is. Because if you have like the cash cow, like disrupting your own cash cow is going to be really tough, as opposed to like, well, this one we're going to end of life and we're going to have a swath of other potential opportunities. Do you have an opinion about like how large enterprises should do that? Like, do you create like the X lab internally? Do you look at partnerships? Do you look at acquisitions? Like, any thoughts on how to navigate that?
I think, look, there's been no end in research, particularly over the last 15 years, on how organizations transform. I mean, we kicked off the great digital transformation conversation, 12, 15 years ago, when we started talking about cloud. And so I think there's been a lot of research on that. My humble opinion is carving things out, putting them on the side, creating special labs, what have you. I don't, this is anecdotally, so please take this with what it is, but I've never seen that really work long term. I think it can get you an interesting proof of concept, and I think it can get you interesting data points. But if you're looking for true change, that is not going to get you there. And unfortunately, the true change comes from the CEO, the board, the executive leadership team being in lockstep on making the change. And if that is not the case, if you're ever talking to someone and you've got some mid-level manager that's driving the catalyst change and there's no executive buy-in, there's no CEO buy-in, there's no board buy-in, then it's never going to work. So you might as well just give up now. Because if you're doing true change that is a significant level of impact to an organization and your board isn't bought in, it's going to fail, because you know what's going to happen for 3 or 4 quarters of that change is things are going to look bad.
Yep.
Revenue's going to slow down.
Yep.
Growth is going to slow. Velocity is going to slow down. All of that stuff starts to slow down. And you're going to have to stand up, particularly if you're a publicly traded company, but even if you're private, you're going to have to stand up to your board. You're going to stand up to your shareholders and say, hey, things look bad now, but trust us, 3 quarters, totally going to be there. And everyone says, I can do that in the first quarter, sure. But the second quarter, the third quarter, when you're still having that same conversation and everyone's got short-term memory on why we're on this journey to begin with, it becomes very difficult. And if you're not all in on holding that, you're going to really struggle, because you're going to want to give up.
So spot on. So many of the organizations that we work with today, we talk about like the first team, going back to Lencioni, because it's like, if you were sitting in the C-suite and you guys are not all aligned to what the actual future of the company is, if your competing line of business BUs are dependent on in-year compensation and all of that, then you're going to be pulling resources and there's going to be this sort of infighting. So I totally love the clarity of everyone, the execs, the board, everyone has to be bought in. I think there's an important point about the expectation setting. I'm wondering if you have any advice though, because people will even say the right thing, right? Like, yes, you have 18 months runway even on this thing. And they're all sitting there shaking their heads and agreeing to that. And then we've all lived through the reality of they weren't actually that bought in. Do you have any like test points or advice for how you get to the clarity of, are they really bought in?
I mean, someone that I think does a really great job of this is good at probing the CEO with those questions. Like, and she's very talented. But I think it really requires a direct approach, which is to say, and do like scenarios like, hey, you've got this strategy that you've invested millions of dollars in the last 6 months. What if I tell you that is incorrect and we need to throw it all away and do something different? What's going to be your response? And I think that's a great question, because if the executive is like, well, I don't care, I'm really wed to this idea, then great. You know what, we're done here. This is never going to work. But if an executive says, you know what, great, then that's what we do. We throw that away and we look for the right path forward. And I think there's questions you can ask that gauge someone's level of commitment. And if they're willing to walk away from money, if they're willing to walk away from time, and that if they've invested, if they're willing to deviate from an idea, then someone is really up to the task of both pivoting frequently if necessary, but defending that pivot to the other execs, shareholders, board, etc.
Yeah, I love that. The specificity of the scenario. What did you say? The scenario probing. Maybe this is related to what we were just talking about, but I'm wondering what one or two of the biggest challenges you've faced as a Catalyst executive, and maybe how you overcome them, what helped you overcome those challenges. Also, we love stories of failure. So if there's a learning, you're like, oh, that was a hard one, that can help us see it too.
I feel like I only learn from failures personally.
Yeah.
But I think I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of a specific scenario. I know the general problem though, and I realized it when I read your book. Again, not to tout the book over and over again, but I think they're important. There's one nugget in the book. If you don't take anything else away from the book, there's one nugget in there that really hit home for me, because it's something that I don't do really well. And that is bringing people along on the journey with you. And that is a problem I know that most catalysts I know have, because we get a vision in our head and we know how to get there. And we just want people to just show up and do the work and follow along. Like, don't ask questions, just do what I tell you, we'll be fine. That's what we want in our head. We don't say that out loud, but secretly that's what we want in our head. And when you have to bring people along on the journey, that means you have to build a clear story, and you have to story tell a lot, and you have to get people excited about the idea, and you have to get them bought in, and you have to really shepherd them through that. And I think that is a lesson I had to learn over and over again, because I really, really struggled in years past to get people bought in and to continue to bring them along. You can't just say once, hey, here's the vision. Aren't you all excited about my new vision? Let's go. No, you have to continually repeat that vision, and you have to get people bought in, and you have to have people understand their role in that vision and continue to bring them on that journey as a collective. And by the way, that's not just the team that reports to you. And that's not the team that supports you on it as a collaborator. That also includes your executive team, your CEO, your board. It includes everyone. And I think that is a lesson I've had to learn over and over again, because I don't think I've done that as well as I could have. And to this day, I do remind myself bring everyone along on the journey with you.
So how do you do that? How do you bring people along now that you know that concretely it needs to be more of a focus?
Um, do a much better job of communicating what's in my head. Like just because I see where we need to go, look, my job is also to write that down and communicate that in a way that others can understand. And I say that last bit because I think it's important because like just communicating what's in my head doesn't necessarily articulate to others why we need to do that and what does that actually mean and what are the ramifications of that. And so I think really being clear on where are we going? Why are we going there? What are the steps that we're going to measure our momentum along the way? And what does good look like? And how do we know it's good? And I think that those are things that I believe many of us as catalysts keep in the back of our head. But for me, it's also writing it down and articulating that, and not just once, but over and over and over again in different mediums, different formats, different levels of altitude. Just really continuously circling back to that point.
What I hear under that is like some sensing skills, maybe empathy and curiosity about like what the person in front of you needs to know, like the purpose, the how, what, where, why, what it means to them, making sure that they actually understand. How do you assess their understanding, both like just full understanding, and then like if they have to do something, are they clear on what they have to do? How do you know when you're like, nailed it?
Sometimes I think, do we ever know? It feels a little bit like a philosophical existential question.
Fair.
How do we know we're there? Do we ever know?
Maybe
I
we
mean, I feel like sometimes I'm like, nailed it. And then like a week later, you're like, wow, I really did not nail it. They
That's
just,
so true.
there was
Yeah,
like some smiling and nodding, but then there was like later, you're like, no, no, didn't nail that one.
totally. Okay, the other thing that comes up for me when people talk about this communication, because it is so critical, and I agree, it's like it's one of the biggest places that we lose people, is the emotion. Because like I listen to you and it just brings up these feelings of like, I want to poke my eye out with a pencil because you just have to slow down and repeat yourself so many times. And it feels like it's slowing down the whole process, even though we know it's actually accelerating it. But with that comes some self-management, some self-awareness. I'm wondering like, how do you navigate what could be like my words, lack of patience, not your words, so that you can stay excited and keep bringing everyone along?
I mean, there's a patience piece of it. Like I've had to learn that. Like I feel like it took me 2 decades, but I'm like, okay, patience, Abby, patience. It's still my daily mantra. And I think that it's something I do struggle with all the time, particularly if things are stressful and there's a lot going on. Like obviously all of our patience goes way down. And I think one of the things I had to really recognize is it isn't just a matter of me saying it, but sometimes no matter how many times I say something, if people don't like the idea of it, they're never going to get bought in. And so you have to understand what are the other things you can do that get people to the objective, but get them there in a way that is meaningful to them, but still achieves your outcome. And I'll use an example. Agile software development has been around for what, 30 years, Shannon? 25? At least 20 something years.
Yep.
And we all feel like surely that is a well understood process, but it's really not. And there's a lot of now baggage tied up in the words agile software development.
Mm.
Um, and so one time I was trying to roll out agile practices at a team, and I was just running to roadblock after roadblock after roadblock, and everyone would be like, yeah, sounds great. And then proceed to not do it at all. And fun fact, just because you're in charge does not mean people will listen to you.
Damn it.
Just so just putting that out there. So I decided like, you know what? It's not that I don't think people really hated the idea of doing agile. I just think that there was a lot of emotion hung up in the framing of the words. So I decided to stop calling it agile and decided to just roll out the rituals around it, but call it something different. And that seemed to work. And so I think
Yes.
it's also
Yes.
not just saying like the words and assuming people will get on board with them, but figuring out if there's limitations to understanding, awareness, if there's baggage around it. Maybe they've tried to implement it before in the team and it failed. And so there's a lot of baggage there. And figuring out if, hey, what's important? It wasn't important for us to be doing agile with air quotes around it. What was important is that we were doing the rituals around them. And so if I called them something different, we're still good there. People will still, we're getting the work done, which is what I wanted. I wanted to have a faster cadence, more transparency around what we were delivering, clearer association with objectives, and the ability for everyone to have line of sight to that. That was the most important thing to me, not that we called it certain words.
I think it's so important because as catalysts, and maybe this is true for a lot of humans, we can get really tied to the vision, our specific vision of the way that we want the thing to be in the world. And what I'm hearing you say is like bringing the curiosity about like, okay, what were the roadblocks here? And being open to like, there's baggage there. So getting back to first principles, but like, what am I actually trying to achieve? What I'm trying to achieve is these different ways of working these rituals. And so how can I do that with the least amount of friction?
And sometimes, look, and I'll be honest, sometimes if you want people to get a certain direction, if you want people to go in a certain direction, but it's a big ask and it's a big lift. Sometimes the easiest thing is to just have that vision in your head, but when you communicate it milestone by milestone.
Yeah.
Sometimes saying, here's the grand vision all at one time is really, really difficult for a lot of people to internalize. So maybe say, hey, we want to implement agile practices, but maybe you're like, hey, you know what we'd like to do? Like to have daily stand-ups. You know what? Let's have some daily stand-ups. And you just kind of roll it out increment by increment. And you're bringing people along with you, but you're not giving them an overwhelming amount of information that they also have to ingest. So sometimes it's understanding the pros and cons of where you bring people in and how you bring that story to them.
Super smart. I love that. Are there other pieces of wisdom that you have for our Catalyst listeners?
I think a big one was find your tribe. Find your tribe of people that are also working on this, much like Shannon, what you and Tracy have developed. But I think sometimes talking to other people that are struggling with the same things you are makes you feel a little bit less crazy. Particularly in a role where you're often, if not the only, you're one of a few. And it can feel like a lot of pressure is on you. And there's a lot of uncertainty, and you're having to hold a lot of that internally because there isn't a lot of people you can lean on in your workplace. Having a tribe outside of the workplace where you can share ideas and best practices and just, not feel crazy all the time, because sometimes it can feel like you're a little crazy. You're like, well, I keep saying this thing and everyone keeps looking at me like I've lost my mind.
Uh-huh. Yeah. 100%. No, I mean, that's why we created the Catalyst Leadership Trust. And though I think it's nice to have like the external perspective where they're like, not only is that not a dirty word to us, but we can see how you could do it bigger, faster, whatever. But there is also, if you can find the people in your context, like most organizations are going to have a couple of catalysts minimum. And so people who can help you navigate like what the institutional history is combined with your catalytic nature can be super impactful.
Yeah, it's just anytime you're in a role in a company and you're one of only a few, if you're a minority, having a support team outside of that can be super beneficial, because when you're in the minority, like I said, you often, because you feel so other, you feel very othered in the role and what you're doing. Having others to say, actually, I see you, and also I've been there, can be immensely validating, and it can really help you continue on with the work, which can often feel a little Sisyphean on a daily basis.
100%. Totally. The power of being witnessed. All right. Last fun question. I'd love to hear about your favorite catalyst, past or present, who inspires you, and why do they stand out to you?
When we started this podcast, I said I don't know anyone, but as I was describing what I've learned from other people, one popped up in my head, and that would be Siobhan McPheeney. She's the CTO at Kohl's and is the best catalyst I think I've ever seen in motion before. She's just really, really great at doing transformative work in large organizations. And a lot of what I have seen and witnessed as ideal ways to handle these scenarios, I've actually observed from her. So I would say Siobhan.
Amazing. We will put a link to her in the show notes. Abby, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. It's a pleasure, as always, to catch up.
Hey, thank you for having me.
To our listeners, thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about how to create bold, powerful change in the world, be sure to check out our book that Abby so beautifully plugged over and over again, Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, or go to our website at catalystconstellations.com. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, please take 10 seconds to rate it on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And of course, as you think about all the catalysts you can now identify in your life, hit the share button and send a link their way. Thanks again.